Can you hear me this time?
Yeah.
Is it too loud or about right?
Good.
About right. Well, the thing I plan to do today is to keep on discussing what the last time I called fundamental intuitive ideas. And any of you who did not get the handout the last time, they will be available afterwards. And also, I have another handout that we can give you after today for what I have to say today. So what I plan to do is to go on talking about these fundamental ideas. And they're all notions that are discussed in TJ sections 1 to 4, and in 9, where there's some discussion of reflective equilibrium, and in number 87, where there's a few pages of verse assigned on justification. So on next Friday, I will decide to go on for another time on this, so that would include the timing of taking a block. And also, I'm interested in explaining these sort of fundamental notions so we get off to, I hope, is some clear understanding of how the notion that's called in the book justice is fairness is put together and assembled, so you'll understand the basic idea from the start. Now, what we're doing, we say, is going through several fundamental notions, fundamental intuitive ideas. I call them intuitive because all of us should have some familiarity with these, and I characterize them as being present in the public political culture, not, of course, exactly in the form in which they are here discussed, but they ought not to be utterly foreign to you, but from everyday life also you should have some sense of them. And the other time I talked about the very basic idea, and I might say the most fundamental of these ideas, is that of society as a system of cooperation between free and equal persons, or between citizens regarded as such persons. That is really the basic idea. Now, all the other ideas that I discussed, while they do not come from that idea by any process of logical deduction, of course, still I think there's a natural move from one step to the other. So you recall that after introducing the notion of society as a system of cooperation, a fair system of cooperation between citizens of free and equal persons, we then introduce the notion of a well-ordered society. Now what's that? We just say, well, we take this idea of society as a system of cooperation, and we imagine it somehow perfectly realized. Suppose things were like that. This is an idealized notion. Then say, well, if it were perfectly realized, well, then we have what is called a well-ordered society. That's a society in which everyone accepts the same principles of justice. We call it their role is to define the fair terms of cooperation. So everyone accepts the same principles of justice. Everyone knows that everyone else accepts them. This is public knowledge. It isn't that we all know in the privacy of our own heart that others do, but people know that we do, and so forth. It's as if we made an agreement on it, so we all know it's known if there had been such an agreement. We also know, and we can reason or believe that that's all that can happen in the case, that the institutions of our society fulfill these principles that define the fair terms of a cooperation, specifies a fair prefer to say. So that sort of idealized idea that comes from just asking what would a society be like if it were the perfect realization within reasonably realistic assumptions and not utopian assumptions of this idea of society, the scheme of fair cooperation. Then the next idea I'm going on to talk about, the one today, is that of what I'm going to call the basic structure of society. This is discussed in section 2. So I'm in effect going over in a slightly different way the notion that is talked about there. And this notion arises from asking, well, which institution or family or scheme of institutions are we going to apply this fundamental intuitive idea of society, the system of cooperation, etc., to? What subject do we apply it to? The answer to that is, well, we're going to apply it to the basic structure of roughly what we would call a modern nation state, this democratic in form. So we say that by the basic structure of society is meant the way in which the main political and legal institutions and social institutions hang together into one system of cooperation and determine and affect the share of benefits from social cooperation. So the kinds of institutions that would then belong to the basic structure, say of our society, or an analogous kind of society, a constitutional regime of some sort, at least that's how it appears, is the Constitution, the way in which the judiciary is organized and how it applies the Constitution, the main parts of the legal system, the different forms of property that are allowed, so private property and means of production would then be part of the basic structure, and also how the economy is organized and so forth. So it applies to that system of institutions as it operates together as a system. So it's designed to regulate and to govern that system of institutions so that it defines in an appropriate way the fair terms of the cooperation. Now, this has the consequence that the principles of justice that are discussed in TJ do not apply directly to particular institutions, say to churches and universities, and to other kinds of organizations. These we think of as associations and organizations within the basic structure, and the various activities of individuals that take place within it. But of course, churches and universities are going to be affected by and perhaps limited by what the principles of justice for the basic structure itself require. For example, it may be the case, well, in fact, indeed it is the case, that the principle of toleration will affect the way in which churches can conduct themselves, so that they cannot, say, use the arm of the state to persecute heretics. And you might say that apostasy, although a theological crime, is not a political or civil crime. So it's going to affect those institutions, but it won't apply directly to them. So perhaps that there'll be aspects or implications of principles of justice that will not apply to these institutions directly, provided that they recognize certain other limits. And again, you can think of examples of an analogous kind for universities as well. in regards, say, to certain requirements about fair equality of opportunity, for example. I won't go into that now. Now, the reason that in justice's fairness one makes a decision to focus on the basic structure is that we're going to take this as the primary subject. It's what we're primarily concerned with. And if it works for the basic structure, well then we can try to extend it elsewhere. If it doesn't work for that, then we probably have to scrap it and begin over again and do something else. So I'm particularly concerned with this case. It's obviously a very important case. And if we can have view for it, well then that's important, regardless of whether it applies to anything else or not. But one reason for focusing on it is that it is the case, at least I believe it's the case, that the nature of the basic structure affects in very profound ways people's aspirations and their character. It affects the conceptions of the good that they have, the sort of things that they can plan to work for and do. And it does that, say, through the way in which the principles of justice assign the basic rights and liberties, say, in the Constitution, it protects certainly these civil rights and liberties, and also how it affects regulates economic institutions, tries to secure or to guarantee certain forms of fair equality of opportunity and the like, and the way in which it regulates or governs or puts certain constraints on the distribution of income and wealth. All those things are fairly obvious. It's obvious that those things can affect people's character, their interests, how they even think of themselves as persons, and so forth. If you're not in a society that, say, adopts certain views of the kind that are going on to discuss, or they're current in the public culture, it never occurs to people, say, to think of themselves as free and equal citizens. So the public conception of justice that a society has affects the way in which everybody in it is going to think of themselves and the kind of aspirations and the like that they're going to have. So that seems to be a very basic kind of influence, and it affects people's prospects in life and the kinds of things that they can hope to achieve and so on. So all this is obvious enough. The reason I'm mentioning these points now is just to explain why it is this is an important subject, and it would be highly desirable to have a view that accounts for our considered convictions of justice in regard to this particular subject. Now, it's also going to be the case that since we will be narrowing the investigation to, say, nation states, that what we would say will not apply in any direct way to the law of nations or the relations between states. Again, I think one should say the same thing that I said before, that if this is a viable view in the case of the basic structure, then maybe one could find a way to extend it to the law of nations or relations between states. So one might think of a kind of well-ordered international society as a society consisting of well-ordered constitutional states. We'll find that Kant has actually or suggests a view like that, and to things of his that we will read later. But all of that is something that one might attempt to do if it would work out for this case. So what that completes actually what I had to say about the first three basic notions, that is, of society as a system of cooperation, of well-ordered society, and of the basic structure. Is all that kind of clear enough? Now, the reason I'm emphasizing this particular, perhaps the last point, is that you must not think that it's going to, in other words, I'm trying to impress on you that this inquiry is fairly narrow in focus, so that even if the conception of justice that's here discussed is correct, it's only going to apply to certain kinds of things. So if we talk about desert, for example, it's not talking about desert in ordinary life and all kinds of relationships that we have, but only how the notion of desert arises in how the basic structure itself ought to be designed. Well, all that is something that come to. Now I want to go on talk about two other fundamental intuitive ideas. This is the idea of the original position, as is described in the book, and I'm also going to say something about the idea of a person, one way in which the term free and equal persons, how persons there is to be taken. Now again, this sequence of ideas flows out in a natural way. And again, this is not a deductive way, it's a way in which we develop these ideas. The question is, how do we determine the fair terms of a cooperation? In other words, how do we do that? And one reason for introducing it, that is, the original position, is find a way to determine what these fair terms are. Now, what we have to do, notice that what we're doing, you have gone over 3 and 4 at all, mention it now, is that we're trying to extend the idea of the social contract to the basic structure itself. In other words, we're trying to extend the idea of a fair agreement to this global object, if you like, I'm calling the basic structure. And in order to do that, that is, extend the idea of agreement, of course, any agreement is only going to be fair if it's given under certain kinds of conditions, in which, for example, no one has unfair bargaining advantages over anyone else. So you can only count, you might say, only reliably suppose that the agreement will be fair if the bargaining power of those engaged in reaching the agreement is somehow fair. So there are a whole variety of conditions that have to be met for any agreement to have a certain kind of weight. Obviously, there can't be fraud or coercion or deception and so on. So somehow we have to characterize this fair agreement situation so that the notion of agreement can be applied to the basic structure itself. So that would be one reason for introducing this notion. And this is a very serious problem. How are we going to do this? Another reason for introducing it is that we want to determine, as I mentioned earlier, the fair terms of the cooperation. Now, there are various ways in which we can think of these as determined. We can suppose that it is simply determined by some external authority, who declares or who lays down what the fair terms of cooperation are between free and equal persons, e.g. by God's law. And we find a view something like this, or it seems to be something like this in Locke, so we want to ask, is it like that or not? But that could be a historical possibility, that it's in God's law what the fair terms of the cooperation should be between free and equal persons. Another way to think of fair terms of the cooperation as determined would be by some common public knowledge. This would be moral knowledge now, as opposed to other kinds of public knowledge. A moral knowledge of a natural moral order, or of a prior and independent order, depending on the moral view that was held in the society. In other words, the idea would be that people claim the power to recognize what was right as determined by some objective order that they're able to grasp by, let's say, moral intuition, what the fair terms of a cooperation should be. It's another possibility, and one might call that order, as some have, a natural law, or the order of natural law, objective moral values. Another way of determining the fair terms of a cooperation would be that have the parties themselves do it by agreement. So they agree. I suppose this obviously the thing I have been leading up to, this alternative which I just mentioned, and we have the parties themselves determine what the fair terms of social cooperation should be by their agreeing in some appropriate situation that's a fair agreement situation on what these terms are to be. And the original position is a solution, or I want to say the solution, that presupposes that it works, is being offered as a way to see how this might be done. We think of this agreement then as determining fair terms of the cooperation as being done by those who are engaged in cooperation, and not by any outside agent who has absolute authority, and not by some objective moral order either, but by them, in terms of what they regard as to their mutual good and benefit, when they're in a situation in which everyone is represented fairly and the conditions of agreement are fair. Now that's what the original position is supposed to be. It's supposed to cope with this question of how the fair terms of the cooperation are determined within this basic idea, or as I ought to adhere to my own language, within the main fundamental intuitive idea with which we started. That's what it's supposed to do. So you should think of it in that way. Now, this situation, original position, is then, of course, going to be purely hypothetical in the sense that the fair terms of the cooperation are going to be terms that persons in this situation would agree to. So in that sense, it's hypothetical. It's also non-historical in the sense that we don't think of the situation as ever actually having happened. And it isn't just an accident or a defect of the history of the world that it hasn't happened. Something wrong with the world, this didn't happen. That's not the point. The point is, it doesn't matter whether it happens or not. That's irrelevant. And indeed, even if it did happen, that wouldn't make any difference, because if we specify it correctly, we already know what the answer is. In other words, we ought to be able, if we define it correctly, to know what people would do. Well, all this is something that I'll come to. But it really doesn't matter that it's actually has happened or not, so long as we can characterize it in a way that we know what would happen, or it's reasonably obvious what would happen. So that's why I say it's neither something actual, it is purely hypothetical and non-historical. By non-historical, I mean that even if it did happen, it doesn't matter anyway, and it hasn't happened, or something like that. Okay? Now, a way I think to think of this, so one doesn't get thrown off by what I might describe as this sort of abstract nonsense that I'm talking, perhaps it seems that way to you. I could sympathize if you did. Think of it, the reasoning of the parties in the original position. We'll use the term parties. Think of what we're doing as describing a reasoning game of some kind. Now, in this game, of course, you have to pretend if you... Is it too loud? I hear a hum every now and then. Is that disturbing anybody? Okay. In this reasoning game, of course, if we, as is done in the book, citizens in society are their own representatives in this situation. Sometimes I'm going to talk as if there are representatives who are not the same as citizens in society. And that's an extra complication. I'll explain later on as to why I do that complication, but forget that for the time being. We're describing a certain reasoning game, the aim of which is to figure out what people would agree to as they engage in this game, if you like, in this situation. And we want to characterize it such that we know what the outcome would be. Now, in this game, like a lot of other games, we, as it were, pretend we're something that we're not. Like, if you have played, as I used to play, I don't know whether people do now or not, the game of Monopoly, well, then you pretend you own a lot of pieces of property and so forth, and other things, and you're engaged in a certain kind of game, or perhaps you engage in, play these Star Wars games where you own empires or planets or something like that. All that's the same thing, and you know how to reason in those games. The fact that you're not, all this is pretend doesn't affect anything. If you characterize it correctly, know what the rules are, then you, in general, know how actors are going to conduct themselves. They're going to try to win, and we know what the rules are, and so forth. So we set this game up, if you like, the same way. Now, this, of course, is kind of a frivolous way to think about it. It's a game, yet this is supposed to be a very important subject of political philosophy, and when we're determining how society is to be run, and certainly that's important. People fight about it all the time and even kill each other occasionally. So why talk about it as a game? Only so you won't get intellectually confused and start asking questions that are really irrelevant, as it will turn out. It helps to think of very important, vital things in terms that reduce the emotional involvement in it. So that once that emotional involvement is reduced, then we can clearly understand what's going on. Or, let's say, more clearly understand what's going on. So, for example, if you think one of the ideas we're going to introduce so that people are represented in the original position fairly and represented solely as free and equal persons, represented solely that way, who are capable of taking place in social cooperation over a complete life, in order to do that, to represent them that way, we're going to say there are all kinds of things that they don't know, like they don't know their position in society, they don't know whether they're a man or woman, they don't know their income and wealth, and so forth, all kinds of other things. Now, since in TJ one talks about people as if they are their own representatives, people have asked, well, if I don't know my social position, if I don't know I'm a man or woman, etc., I must have lost my mind. How can I reason? Now, that seems offhand perhaps not a sensible objection, but it's a very natural objection, and it's very easy to fall into that if you take the whole picture too literally. It's all designed to determine what the fair terms of a cooperation are. And we're setting up this situation in which people reason subject to certain kinds of constraints, limitations on knowledge, situations characterized as fair, and a variety of other things. Also, the outcome of the reasoning is going to specify for us what the fair terms of the cooperation are. That's the idea. And it doesn't matter that the things that we don't know, and one ought not to think of the psychological effect on us of, say, not knowing who we are in terms of social position and so on. So long as the parties know how to reason, that's all that counts. If the game is set up correctly. Of course, if it's not set up correctly, then it's not going to work. But those kinds of objections are extremely natural, and I think probably everyone at some time falls into them. I know from my own experience how it's going to deal with this. This lesson is going to work. Well, one thinks of it in this way. And I think if you think of it in this way, a lot of questions that might seem troublesome to you are not actually going to give you any difficulty. Now, I'll mention one other point. What the parties will have to choose between is certain principles of justice that are found within the traditional moral philosophy. So what they have, so to speak, is a menu, if you like, say two principles that I will describe later and that are discussed in chapter 2 in some detail and that we'll come to after Locke. And they have principle of utility, two forms of utilitarianism that are discussed or mentioned in sections 6 and 5 and 6, and there's intuitionism, etc. Now, they have a menu, so they don't, from their own reasoning, generate these principles or conceptions of justice. Those are already generated from the history of moral philosophy, and they are then presented with a list. It's something like they go into a restaurant, if you like, and they have a menu of conceptions of justice, and they have to select one from the list. So this whole construction of the original position is a selection device. It's just a device to select from a menu of conceptions that the history of our moral tradition has thrown up, if you like. It may be in the future there'll be other conceptions that will be developed, and if they were added on the list, that might be better. So even if we know what would be selected from the list, that's no argument to the effect it's the best of all. It's just saying it's the best that we have that's available and talked about now. So it's just kind of what they're reasoning about is how to select off this menu. And I'll mention one other point before I say some things about the notion of the person, which I have to go on to. I think it's extremely important, in order not to get misled, that we want to distinguish between, and I hope it's not getting ahead, but I think some people are bound to be concerned by this, between 3 points of view that we have to keep in mind in considering this notion of justice. There's a point of view of you and me, that is of us. Who are, as students of philosophy, trying to set up some conception of justice and to find out if it gives, as I will talk the next time, a better account of our considered judgments in reflective equilibrium. What we're trying to do is to understand our own ideas of justice. We're not trying to understand how government works except indirectly. We're not trying to understand how institutions work except indirectly. We're trying to understand our own thoughts about the justice and the injustice of what I call the basic justice. So we're aiming at a kind of self-understanding, and you and I are setting up this view and other views that we're examining, and that's the point of view of us, of you and me. Now, in order to understand our own ideas of justice, about the basic structure, we construct this idea of the original position. And we talk about there being certain parties in this position. They are either us, that's the view that the book takes as we pretend that we're our own representatives, or another view, which I think has some advantages, we can think of them actually as our representatives, who are acting on certain instructions from us. Perhaps they are our guardians, our trustees of our welfare. So there's another point of view, which is that of the parties in the original position. Now these are purely persons within this reasoning game. They're not actual people. They're characterized as they are, let's say, in order to determine what the fair terms of the cooperation are. Then the third point of view that I'll mention is that of persons in a well-ordered society. That is the kind of society that would exist if it's a perfectly realized in the sense that I described earlier, the conception, say, of justice as fairness. What would those people be like? And I mention this because I found that one has to be more careful than I was in the book. You find that people think that because the parties are described in the original position as mutually disinterested, that then the view in TJ is that people are self-interested, or something like that, and as if there's a view of human nature in which people are characterized as selfish or self-interested. Now, perhaps there is I don't believe that sound, but insofar as that is argued from places in the text where it's said that they're mutually disinterested in, then that would just be a mistake of not distinguishing between the point of view of you and me, us, persons in a well-ordered society is another point of view, and that of the parties. The fact that the parties are mutually disinterested doesn't in itself say anything about the moral psychology of us or of those in a well-ordered society. So we have to be sure we're keeping straight these three different points of view. Yeah?
I'm just trying to say that you're making no assumptions about the psychological makeup of these people. Is that what you're trying to say? They're just disinterested in the affairs of the other.
Assumptions are made about the psychology of people, but the assumptions don't arise from the representation of the parties as being mutually disinterested. In other words, the parties will be assigned various psychological beliefs about the nature of people. And the parties' relation to each other will be described as mutually disinterested. In order to find out what the psychology of people is in this view, you have to look at part 3, where it is described in some detail. And of course, I invent a kind of a psychology for this purpose. I hope it's not too inaccurate as people actually are. But at any rate, the actual psychology is in part 3. All I'm saying at the moment is that the fact that parties are mutually disinterested doesn't say anything offhand about the psychology of people in a well-ordered society. Think of it in the following way. If you have a group of trustees that who are trying to do the best they can for their guardians, and perhaps they come from, and they know that in a way that they're each responsible to different people, and they're under obligation to do the best they can for those for whom they are responsible. Then we might say that the trustees as a group are mutually disinterested with respect to one another. Or, what did I say? Yes, mutually disinterested, right? That's the phrase I use. Sometimes I forget. Now, that doesn't say that the trustees believe that those for whom they are guardians are selfish or anything like that. They might believe that, but they might not. Just the fact that you're a guardian and you're responsible for a particular individual and in relation to other guardians, you have to do what you can for them, doesn't say what your beliefs will be about people in general. So all I'm saying at the moment, does this seem clear what I'm saying? But you just have to distinguish. Okay, now perhaps I should go on and say a few things about the notion of person as I've indicated here. Well, I will say very little about this. I did give an account on the sheet that I think will help someone, at least I hope will help someone. We want to think of persons as I said, free and equal person. And that's a phrase that occurs in this most fundamental idea that we began with. So I have to interpret that. Now, one thing to keep in mind is a very important point to keep in mind is that this conception of the person is, you might say, a political conception. Now, what do I mean by that? Because I think that's an uncommon phrase. So it's a term of art that I have to explain what I mean by it. It means that this conception of the person is designed to go with a political conception of justice for the basic structure. So we are designing this conception or abstracting it from the public culture to go with a political conception. So while I don't think the book is clear about this as it ought to be, I hope in general that one could think of it as not primarily a philosophical conception, not a metaphysical conception, and only in the sense in which it is discussed in part 3, a psychological one that has certain psychological elements, but one that characterizes how people within the public culture, public political culture of society, say like ours, or we might imagine it to be if it were a more perfect constitutional regime than it is, how citizens might think of one another from the standpoint of public life. And I think of them then as equal, free and equal, and so there would be those two attributes of them. Now, what does equality mean within this framework? It means that they are equally capable of taking part in and engaging in social cooperation. And they're equally capable of honoring the fair terms of cooperation that are specified by the principles of justice. And we might then say that these are persons who have two moral powers. One would be the moral power to understand and to apply and to honor, that is, to follow, act in accordance with the principles of justice that define the fair terms of cooperation, and that they have another moral power, namely the moral power to have a conception of the good, which I think of as an ordered family of final ends. And normally it also includes some philosophical or religious or moral doctrine in the light of which a person interprets and understands those final ends. And one could think of those two moral powers as connected with the two elements that we distinguish in the notion of the cooperation. Remember that the notion of cooperation involves the notion of fair terms of cooperation, and it also involves the notion of everybody's good. I mean, each person having a notion of their rational advantage. So we just say, well, we parallel with that, and we say with anyone who can engage in cooperation is going to have the power, the moral power, to understand, to apply, and to follow, to honor, and so forth, the specification of fair terms, and they're also going to have a notion of rational advantage or good. So again, the idea of their having two moral powers is going to drop out in a natural way, although not in some deductive way, from the notion of cooperation. At least that's the idea. Now, we might say that persons are free. We might contrast them with slaves. Well, there are a lot of things I might say here. Things that might be better rather than to attempt to go over that in about 5 minutes or so that I have left. I think it's a temptation of a professor to think you have to say everything. If you don't say it, somehow things haven't gone well, whereas actually I probably said already far too much. And what might be better, I stop for a moment and ask whether people have questions about what I'm saying. I don't exactly have a sense that I'm going on without people understanding anything. or not. But I like to know. I like to have some sense. Yes.
You mentioned that the third way of determining the fair terms, that the people themselves would determine the fair terms.
Yes.
How then, and if nobody's supposed to have a bargaining advantage power
Over any of the others.
over any of the others, then then how do they agree on agreeing about the fair terms that are to be used? You know what I mean?
Well,
In other words, you said that the people themselves should determine the fair terms in the cooperation.
yeah.
But then what are the fair terms that they should use to agree on that?
Well, those are all determined by how they are characterized in the original position. In other words, we have to describe some kind of a procedure and how they are to reason and so forth and so on. Actually, it turns out to be rather simple. They are required to select from the menu one conception, then they all have the menu and so forth. And what if it turns out there aren't enough rules when we think about it, we always add another one, I would hope, so we get a determinate result that's okay. The thing we have to do is to explain each rule that we add. It can't be arbitrary, it's got to be some reason for it, like that rule is derived from the fact that we want to represent the equality of persons. So the representatives are situated symmetrically with respect to one another, so they all have the same rights in this procedure and things of that kind. We say we want to represent them solely as free and equal persons and not as free and equal persons who are poor or who are white or black or who so on and so on. So we don't allow them to have that information. So introduce the phrase the veil of ignorance, which is just to convey the idea that they are to be represented solely as free and equal persons, capable of engaging cooperation in free life, etc. So we have to explain each aspect of this situation in terms of some reason that, well, we need that to make it fair, we need it to make it so it represents the kind of thing we want, and so on. And a lot of those details will come to when we come to chapter 3. Yes.
It seems to me that from what you said, we are attempting to then create a determinate result from
Yeah.
this intellectual conception.
Yeah.
But it seems to me that since we're attempting to apply, as you said, rules and conditions ahead of time to reach this result,
Yeah.
the result the particular result we're seeking is somehow implicit in
Yeah.
this intuitive idea we have.
Yeah.
So in this sort, we're
Well,
assuming that there's some sort of idea that we're working towards by creating a determinate situation.
yeah, that's a very good question asked. Namely, it might appear as if by aiming for a determinate result, there's some idea that we already have in mind that we're working towards. And perhaps you would go on to say, well, that is prejudges the case, perhaps, or so on. Whether it does or not is something that we ought to talk about. I'm inclined to think that even if we know where we want to go, that's all right, provided we get some very good reasons for going there. But you might disagree. But so we might hold that aside at the moment. I think it's connected up with a notion that we'll talk about the next time, say the notion of reflective equilibrium and justification. I will talk about the next time. So for that, you want to look over relevant passages on reflective equilibrium in 4 and in 9, and what's said about justification in native death. And then after having finished up with that, we'll go on to work on Monday. But perhaps in the context of that, I can come back to your question, but that is something that we have to think about. Look, I would like to ask you before you leave, because they're out of books at the Coop. I want to ask them to order some more books, and since they are very unhappy if we ever order books, how many as of now say 75% or more? Do you all want to help me count them? To take the class, so I have an idea of how many.
And don't have books.
Okay. Who don't have books, right? Who don't have books.
Some of them.
Huh?
I've got some of them, but not all of them.
Okay. If you don't have a book, perhaps you should hold up your hand. And also, I have up here handouts, and if you want them, for today and for last time.